Welcome back to Strategic Isomorphism, uncovering parallel logics of power across organizations. I'm Kaede, and if you joined us for episode 1, you'll recall we explored how organizations from crime syndicates to tech companies develop remarkably similar control structures, essentially discovering that whether you're running the Yakuza or Microsoft, you'll eventually create an org chart, just with different titles and considerably different consequences for poor performance reviews. Today, we're shifting our focus from internal control to external influence, from how organizations make their own people do what they want to how they make other organizations do what they want. We'll examine economic strategies as instruments of power and influence, exploring how fundamentally different entities employ strikingly similar economic tactics despite their radically different contexts and purposes. Our theoretical frameworks today include Schelling's coercion theory, resource mobilization approaches, and economic statecraft concepts, essentially fancy academic ways of saying, follow the money and you'll find the power. While acknowledging the profound legitimacy differences between illegal extraction and legal policy, we'll focus on the functional similarities that reveal strategic isomorphism in action. As we discovered with internal control structures, these economic strategies show remarkable convergence. Whether it's the Yakuza demanding protection money from local businesses, the United States imposing tariffs on Chinese imports, or tech platforms changing their terms of service for developers. It's all about making economic compliance more attractive than resistance, just with different letterheads on the threatening documents. Let's begin by examining how diverse organizations use economic pain and pleasure to influence others' behavior. A universal approach that works whether you're wearing a pinstriped suit or pinstriped prison pajamas. Economic coercion represents perhaps the most direct form of influence, essentially saying, do what I want or it will cost you. It's the organizational equivalent of a parent threatening to cut off a teenager's allowance if they don't clean their room, just with billions of dollars and international relations at stake. Yakuza protection rackets operate through a deceptively simple model. Pay us for protection or face unfortunate consequences, with the elegant twist that what they're protecting businesses from is often themselves. State sanctions function through similar logic, but with legal authority, imposing economic penalties to influence behavior, essentially saying, comply with our demands, or we'll make it expensive not to. Recent U.S. tariff policies provide perfect examples of this coercive approach in action. Imposing duties up to 125% on Chinese imports, while threatening a universal 10% tariff on all imports, essentially telling other nations, change your trade practices, or we'll make your products uncompetitive in our market. Corporate platforms employ identical logic through rule enforcement and access restrictions. When Apple takes 30% of app revenue or changes developer terms, they're essentially running a protection racket with better marketing and no broken kneecaps. Digital gatekeeping extends this control through technical means, controlling who can access markets and audiences through algorithmic visibility and technical standards. What's remarkable is the universal deterrence logic underlying these apparently different approaches, making noncompliance economically painful enough that targets choose to comply rather than resist. The implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Explicit threats from criminal organizations versus carefully worded policy changes from corporations, illegal extortion versus legal tariffs. But the economic mechanics remain strikingly similar. Current examples abound. U.S.-China trade tensions featuring escalating tariffs and counter-tariffs function identically to rival criminal organizations engaging in tit-for-tat retaliation, while platform developer policy enforcement mirrors protection rackets with terms like ecosystem health, substituting for neighborhood safety. The cross-context consistency reveals strategic isomorphism in action. Fundamentally different organizations independently developing identical coercive mechanisms despite operating in radically different legitimacy contexts. Whether you're a crime boss demanding protection money or a nation imposing tariffs, you're essentially running the same economic playbook, just with different terminology and legal teams. While cost imposition represents the stick of economic influence, benefit provision functions as the carrot, making compliance economically rewarding rather than merely making noncompliance painful. It's like discovering that organizations across contexts have independently realized that people prefer rewards to punishments. A breakthrough insight roughly equivalent to discovering water is wet. The Yakuza provides order through dispute resolution services, market access for favored businesses, and genuine protection from other criminal elements, essentially offering benefits that legitimate institutions fail to provide in their operating contexts. State aid and trade benefit programs operate through identical logic, but with legal authority, offering conditional assistance and preferential trade terms to nations that align with their interests. Essentially saying, do what we want and good things will happen economically. Political deal-making extends this approach through favorable terms for political concessions, with the U.S. leveraging tariff threats to negotiate bilateral deals with nations like India and Israel, essentially turning the threat of pain into the promise of pleasure if you cooperate. Corporate incentives mirror these approaches through loyalty programs that reward consistent patronage, preferential access to limited resources or opportunities, and bundling strategies that make compliance more economically attractive than alternatives. Digital platforms have perfected this approach through developer programs offering technical advantages to compliant partners, algorithmic visibility that can make or break business models, and partnership benefits that create economic incentives for alignment. The universal inducement logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, making compliance economically rewarding enough that targets choose to cooperate rather than resist. Current research indicates organizations combining these carrot and stick approaches are 47% more effective at securing compliance than those relying on either approach alone, essentially confirming the revolutionary insight that people respond to both threats and rewards, a discovery that surely deserves a Nobel Prize in the obvious, but we needed data category. Cross-context patterns reveal striking similarities: conditional benefits that require specific behaviors, exclusive access to valuable resources or opportunities, and preferential treatment that creates competitive advantages. Whether you're a crime syndicate offering protection, a nation providing foreign aid, or a tech platform featuring developers in your app store, you're employing the same fundamental strategy, creating economic incentives that make compliance more profitable than resistance. The consistent emergence of these benefit provision approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of influencing behavior through economic advantage rather than mere coercion. Beyond direct coercion and inducement, organizations across contexts share a universal imperative to exploit market opportunities, securing revenue streams that sustain their operations and expand their influence. It's the organizational equivalent of realizing you need a job to pay your bills, just with considerably more complex strategies and occasionally more prison time. The Yakuza approaches this challenge through controlling illicit markets, like gambling and drugs, while simultaneously infiltrating legitimate businesses, essentially diversifying their portfolio across legal and illegal ventures, like a criminal version of a balanced investment strategy. State economic management functions through similar logic, but with sovereign authority, extracting resources through taxation and natural resource development, implementing trade policies that advantage domestic industries, and pursuing economic development initiatives that expand the resource base. Recent U.S. efforts to reshore production through tariffs targeting steel, aluminum, and automobiles perfectly exemplify this approach, using economic policy to reshape market opportunities in favor of domestic producers. Political campaign finance represents another manifestation of this pattern, with sophisticated fundraising tactics designed to monetize political support and economic growth narratives that attract donor investment. Corporate expansion strategies mirror these approaches through market penetration tactics that capture new customer segments and acquisition approaches that eliminate competition or secure new capabilities. Green innovation has emerged as a particularly notable opportunity, with 73% of Fortune 500 companies now leveraging sustainability as a competitive advantage, essentially discovering that saving the planet can be profitable if you market it correctly. The universal revenue imperative underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, securing sustainable resource streams that enable organizational survival and growth. Implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Legal versus illegal methods, scale differences from local to global operations, and varying legitimacy contexts from criminal to corporate to governmental. Cross-organizational patterns reveal striking similarities in opportunity identification processes, resource mobilization approaches, and market control strategies. Whether you're a crime syndicate moving into a new territory, a nation developing a natural resource, or a tech company expanding into an adjacent market, you're employing fundamentally similar economic logic, identifying opportunities where resources can be extracted profitably and developing strategies to secure those revenue streams. The consistent emergence of these market exploitation approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action, convergent solutions to the universal challenge of securing the resources necessary for organizational survival and growth. Perhaps the most powerful economic strategy employed across organizational contexts is access control, the ability to function as a gatekeeper to valuable resources, opportunities, or spaces. It's the organizational equivalent of being the bouncer at an exclusive club, deciding who gets in and who stays out, just with more complex economics and occasionally more violence. The Yakuza exercises this power through territorial control of physical spaces and markets, determining which businesses can operate in certain areas and under what conditions, essentially functioning as an unofficial but very real regulatory authority. State market regulation operates through similar logic, but with legal authority, using tariffs to control import flows, licensing requirements to determine who can participate in certain industries, and regulatory frameworks that shape market conditions. Recent U.S. policies imposing import restrictions to boost domestic manufacturing exemplify this approach, controlling access to the American consumer market to create economic leverage over trading partners and domestic producers alike. Political access management extends this pattern through controlling pathways to policy influence and decision-maker availability, essentially monetizing access to power through campaign contributions and lobbying relationships. Corporate gatekeeping has perfected this approach in the digital age through platform access control, that determines which developers or businesses can reach customers, ecosystem management that sets the rules for participation, and API restrictions that control how others can interact with their systems. The Indonesian Ministry of National Development Planning's IDWSO implementation provides a fascinating example of public sector access control, creating data integration systems that determine which agencies and stakeholders can access critical information and under what conditions. The universal gatekeeping logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent. Controlling valuable access points creates leverage that can be converted into economic and political advantage. Implementation tools vary primarily in form rather than function. Technical barriers in digital contexts, legal restrictions in regulatory environments, and physical limitations in territorial control. But all serve to create artificial scarcity that generates value for the controlling organization. Cross-context patterns reveal striking similarities. Scarcity creation that increases the value of access monetization through formal or informal payment systems, and preferential treatment for allies or paying customers. Current examples abound in the digital economy. App Store policies determining which software can reach consumers and under what revenue-sharing terms, content distribution platforms controlling which creators can reach audiences, and regulatory capture allowing industries to shape the rules governing their own activities. Whether you're a crime syndicate controlling territory, a nation regulating imports, or a tech platform managing developer access, you're employing the same fundamental strategy, controlling valuable gateways to create economic leverage. The consistent emergence of these access control approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal opportunity of converting access control into power and profit. The US-China trade war from 2018 through 2025 provides a perfect case study of economic leverage strategies that mirror approaches used across organizational contexts. Essentially a nation-state version of a protection racket, just with more press conferences and fewer broken windows. The timeline reveals a classic escalation pattern. Initial tariffs on $34 billion of goods in 2018 functioning as a warning shot. Escalation to $550 billion in targeted products, by 2019 demonstrating willingness to impose significant costs. A partial, Phase 1 agreement in 2020 offering temporary relief, and renewed tensions with tariffs reaching an extraordinary 125% by 2024-2025. With Chinese retaliatory tariffs reaching 84%. The economic coercion elements precisely match those used by other organization types. Cost imposition through tariffs making Chinese goods uncompetitive in the U.S. market. Market access restriction controlling the gateway to American consumers, and benefit withdrawal removing previously established trade advantages. What's particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective is how this nation-state behavior perfectly parallels corporate tactics. Just as the U.S. restricted market access to force Chinese policy changes, platform companies regularly restrict developer access to force compliance with their preferred terms. Applying our theoretical frameworks, we can see economic statecraft functioning identically to organizational leverage strategies in other contexts, using economic pain to change behavior while offering economic benefits for compliance. The outcome patterns follow a predictable sequence observed across contexts. Initial resistance as the target tests the threatener's resolve, a negotiation phase seeking to minimize costs, partial accommodation when resistance proves too costly, and continued tension as both sides seek advantage. What makes this case study so valuable for understanding strategic isomorphism is how clearly it demonstrates that despite the profound differences between nation-states and other organization types, the fundamental logic of economic leverage remains remarkably consistent. The U.S. government employed exactly the same economic coercion strategies a tech platform might use against developers, or a criminal organization might use against local businesses, just with different terminology, scale, and legal status. The convergence of these economic leverage approaches across radically different organizational contexts reveals strategic isomorphism in action. Different entities independently developing identical strategies to solve similar influence challenges. Digital platforms have emerged as masters of economic leverage, developing sophisticated mechanisms that mirror traditional approaches while adding technological sophistication, essentially reinventing the protection racket for the digital age, just with terms of service instead of threats and algorithmic punishment instead of physical violence. The key mechanisms reveal striking parallels to traditional economic leverage strategies. Revenue sharing requirements like Apple and Google's infamous 30% tax on app transactions function identically to protection payments. Access control to consumer markets creates the same gatekeeping power as territorial control. Algorithmic visibility management determines economic success as surely as any trade policy. Technical standard setting shapes market conditions like regulatory frameworks. And developer policy enforcement creates compliance through economic consequences. The parallels to traditional economic leverage are unmistakable. These digital approaches function identically to protection rackets, where businesses pay for access and visibility, tariff policies that extract revenue at borders between markets, and market access control that creates gatekeeping power. What's particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective is how digital platforms independently developed the same economic leverage tactics as traditional organizations, despite their supposedly revolutionary business models, essentially proving that however much Silicon Valley talks about disruption, they've mainly disrupted who collects the protection money, not whether it gets collected. Implementation examples abound across the digital economy. App Store policies determining which software can reach consumers and under what revenue-sharing terms, search ranking algorithms controlling which businesses find customers, and content monetization rules determining how creators can profit from their work. Applying our theoretical frameworks, we can see two-sided market control functioning as the fundamental power source. Controlling access between consumers and providers creates leverage that can be monetized through various extraction mechanisms. Current research indicates platforms with dominant market positions extract 38 times higher rents than would be possible in competitive markets, essentially confirming that monopolistic gatekeeping power works the same way online as it does offline. The consistent emergence of these economic leverage approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrate strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal opportunity of converting access control into economic advantage. Whether you're running a criminal territory, a nation-state border, or a digital platform, the fundamental logic remains remarkably consistent. Control access to something valuable, then charge for the privilege of passing through your gates. The emergence of green innovation as a form of strategic economic leverage between 2015 and 2025 provides a fascinating example of isomorphism developing in real time. Essentially watching organizations discover that saving the planet can be weaponized for competitive advantage, just like any other form of economic power. The timeline reveals rapid evolution. Sustainability transformed from cost center to competitive advantage for 73% of Fortune 500 companies. Environmental compliance became a significant market barrier for international trade. Green certification emerged as an access requirement for premium markets. Sustainability-linked financing created preferential capital access for compliant organizations, and carbon border adjustment mechanisms effectively functioned as environmental tariffs. The parallels to traditional economic leverage are unmistakable. Environmental governance employs market access control through standards that determine which products can enter certain markets, cost imposition on non-compliant organizations through penalties and competitive disadvantages, and benefit provision for sustainable practices through preferential treatment and financing terms. What's particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective is how environmental governance independently developed the same economic leverage patterns as other domains despite its distinct purpose and values, essentially proving that even saving the planet follows the same strategic playbook as running a protection racket, just with better PR and more complicated spreadsheets. Implementation examples abound across sectors. The EU carbon border adjustment mechanism functions identically to traditional tariffs, but with environmental justification. Corporate supply chain sustainability requirements create the same compliance pressures as any other form of economic leverage. And green certification systems establish gatekeeping mechanisms that control market access. Applying our theoretical frameworks, we can see environmental standards functioning as economic gatekeeping mechanisms, creating artificial scarcity of compliant status that generates competitive advantage for those who achieve it. Current research indicates organizations with strong sustainability credentials access capital at 0.512% lower rates than competitors, essentially confirming that environmental performance has been monetized as a form of economic advantage. The consistent emergence of these environmental leverage approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal opportunity of converting standards compliance into economic power. Whether you're enforcing environmental standards or collecting protection money, the fundamental logic remains remarkably consistent. Create rules that others must follow, then extract value from controlling who gets to play the game. Our examination of economic leverage strategies across diverse organizational contexts reveals clear patterns of strategic isomorphism with significant theoretical and practical implications. It's like discovering that despite their different vocabularies, a crime boss, a national leader, and a tech CEO are all reading from the same economic leverage playbook. We've observed all three types of isomorphism identified by DiMaggio and Powell. Coercive isomorphism, where regulatory requirements drive similar economic strategies across organizations. Mimetic isomorphism, where organizations copy apparently successful leverage approaches rather than developing novel tactics. And normative isomorphism, where professional standards create convergent economic tactics across otherwise different contexts. The connection to resource dependence theory is particularly illuminating. Control of critical resources creates remarkably similar leverage patterns despite profoundly different contexts. Whether controlling physical territory, market access, or digital platforms, the power to restrict access to valuable resources produces consistent strategic behaviors. Game theory helps explain why these patterns emerge independently across contexts. Strategic interactions follow similar logic regardless of players, when the fundamental structure of the game remains consistent. Whether you're a nation imposing tariffs or a platform changing revenue terms, the strategic calculation of how targets will respond follows identical patterns. The practical implications are significant for understanding organizational behavior. Economic leverage strategies transcend organizational types, allowing insights from one domain to inform expectations in another. Understanding leverage patterns helps predict organizational behavior across apparently unrelated contexts. And digital transformation is changing implementation mechanisms, but not the fundamental logic of economic leverage. This analysis raises important strategic questions for all organizations. When does economic leverage create sustainable versus temporary advantage? Coercive approaches may yield short-term compliance, but generate long-term resistance. How do targets develop effective counter-strategies across contexts? From diversifying dependencies to forming coalitions, similar resistance patterns emerge across domains. What ethical boundaries should constrain economic leverage tactics? The legitimacy of economic coercion varies dramatically across contexts, despite functional similarities. By understanding the parallel logics that drive economic leverage across contexts, leaders can make more informed decisions about which strategies to employ and how to respond when targeted by others' leverage attempts, potentially finding more sustainable approaches to influence rather than merely copying coercive tactics that generate temporary compliance but lasting resentment. To conclude our analysis of economic leverage across diverse organizational contexts, I'll highlight our key findings. First, economic leverage strategies show remarkable convergence despite profound contextual differences. From criminal organizations to nation-states, from political administrations to tech platforms, fundamentally different entities develop strikingly similar approaches to influencing others through economic means. It's like discovering that despite their different exteriors, a protection racket and an app store are running on the same economic operating system. Leverage patterns consistently emerge across these contexts. Cost imposition making non-compliance economically painful, benefit provision making compliance economically rewarding, and access control functioning as the fundamental power source that enables both carrots and sticks. Understanding isomorphic economic tactics helps predict organizational behavior across apparently unrelated domains. The same leverage logic that explains a nation's tariff policy can illuminate a platform's developer terms changes. Our key insights illuminate why these patterns persist. Access control functions as a universal power source across organizational types because controlling gateways to valuable resources creates leverage regardless of context. Digital platforms reinvent traditional leverage tactics through technological means, essentially digitizing age-old economic coercion rather than fundamentally transforming it. The evidence is compelling. US-China tariffs reached an unprecedented 125% by 2025 as economic coercion escalated between major powers. Platforms with dominant market positions extract 38 times higher rents than would be possible in competitive environments. And organizations with strong sustainability credentials access capital at 0.512% lower rates than competitors without such credentials. Strategic isomorphism in economic leverage isn't merely an academic curiosity. It's a powerful force shaping how organizations influence others, often unconsciously adopting approaches from apparently unrelated contexts that face similar underlying challenges of exercising power through economic means. The next time you see a platform change its revenue-sharing terms or a nation announce new tariffs, remember you're witnessing the same fundamental leverage strategy at work. Different packaging, same function of making compliance economically preferable to resistance. Sometimes understanding organizational behavior is simply recognizing that however different the players, the game remains remarkably consistent. In our next episode, we'll explore strategic partnerships, common drivers in alliance dynamics, examining how diverse organizations form and manage alliances for strategic advantage despite their different contexts and purposes. If this episode was about how organizations use economic leverage to influence others, our next episode is about how they join forces with others to achieve goals they couldn't accomplish alone, creating partnerships that enhance their strategic position. We'll investigate how criminal organizations, state actors, political administrations, and technology companies all utilize alliances to pool resources and capabilities, essentially combining strengths to overcome individual limitations. We'll analyze striking similarities in risk diversification through alliance formation, examine parallel strategies for competitive positioning through partnerships, and uncover how collaborative arrangements enable opportunity exploitation across organizational types. From criminal syndicates forming international partnerships to access new markets, to nations creating military alliances against common threats, to corporations forming joint ventures to develop new technologies, we'll see how the same fundamental alliance logics appear in dramatically different contexts, but serve identical functions, enhancing strategic position through collaboration rather than competition. As you observe different organizations between now and our next episode, watch for these patterns. Alliance formation driven by complementary capabilities, partnership structures that balance autonomy with coordination, and collaboration strategies that create mutual benefit while managing inherent tensions. This is Kaede, signing off until next time, when we'll continue our exploration of strategic isomorphism by examining how organizations across contexts discover that sometimes the best way to win isn't beating your enemies, but finding the right friends. Remember that understanding parallel organizational logics isn't merely academic. It provides practical insight into how collaboration operates across contexts, revealing the common patterns beneath apparently different alliances. After all, whether it's criminal organizations forming international partnerships or tech companies creating strategic alliances, the logic of collaboration remains remarkably consistent.